when you can take DNA from people who lived in the past and compare it to each other and with people living today, you see things that you just didn't even imagine before. The steppe migrations, the expansion of Lapidar pottery culture people of East Asian ancestry to the Southwest Pacific. The world's full of history that we didn't know about before, and it just shows us how little we knew before and how little we still know. Every time we get DNA from Africa from more than 3,000 years ago, it's a huge surprise. You look in Malawi and South Central Africa, the people there 3,000 years ago, nothing like the people there today. They're a population that simply doesn't exist anymore. And you sort of are confronted with this data and you say, I don't know anything anymore. What's really happened is the introduction of a new scientific instrument that is able to measure things that have not been measured before. Ancient DNA is really a remarkable technology. There was no data of any real meaning before 2010. And at that time, we simply could not look at DNA from the bones of people who lived in the past and compare them to each other and people who live today. So really all we could do was to speculate about how people who lived at any one place in the past related to other people and to people today. And there was a reasonable set of hypotheses that people spread in a simple way, moving from one place to the other out of an origin in Africa, maybe 50 or 60 or 70,000 years ago, spread to different parts of Eurasia and eventually to Australia and to the Americas. And once people got to a place, people pretty much stayed there without much change afterward. We had this bias that modern humans, as they spread out of Africa, had not mixed with the archaic humans they encountered, like the Neanderthals. It looked like a simple out-of-Africa spread. Then after 2010, it became possible to lift the veil on the data and see whether that was true. And what was really amazing was every time we got data from a place that we haven't seen, the results were surprising and new and different from what we expected, different from what I expected, the biases I had coming into this work. When we looked at the data, there was very, very clear evidence that Neanderthals that we were sequencing from Europe were more closely related to people outside of Africa today than people inside Africa today. And it became absolutely clear that as modern humans moved out of Africa, they mixed with the local archaic population, and about 2% of the DNA from non-Africans today comes from these archaic humans. And that was just the first of many, many surprises that comes out of this ancient DNA revolution. I was working mostly on medical genetics and trying to learn about risk factors for disease, and I became very, very interested in trying to wed these two areas, studies of people living today and studying of ancient DNA. And the people who were leading this work in the world were not really applying these methodologies at all to people living in the last 20,000 or 15,000 years. But the last 10 or 15 or 5,000 years is when the world got to be the way it is today, when all the languages diversified, when the cultural variation that you see appears. And so you can look at diverse people around the world today and try to understand how that all comes together. And so I completely retooled my laboratory. We started with a mammoth that had been dredged up in Hurricane Sandy on the ocean floor off Cape Cod so that we didn't contaminate it with human DNA, and see if we could extract DNA from a mammoth tooth that had been dredged up. And then we started looking at our first human DNA, and we started working with a colleague, David Anthony, who is an archaeologist and an amateur linguist who had become interested in asking how it is that the languages that are spoken across a wide swath of Eurasia, languages like Sanskrit, Indic, Iranian languages, English, which is a Germanic language, Italic, like Latin, Tocharian, that was in eastern China, or Xinjiang, or Hittite in what's now Turkey in the Anatolian, how it is that these languages came to be so closely related. He had a theory, which was that this might be related to people who lived in the steppes north of the Caspian Sea, a steppe culture called the Yamnaya, who are the first people to take wheeled vehicles, using wheels that had just been invented, out onto the open steppe lands. So we sequenced some bones from the Yamnaya and from their successor cultures, and also some bones from Germany to see whether the Yamnaya might have had an impact on the history of these people. And we got this incredible result from this data. The Yamnaya had this very distinctive ancestry that is a cocktail of genetically recognizable components that are similar to what you see in Europeans today, but somehow more extreme. And when you look at the farmers who lived in Europe before 5,000 years ago, for example, in Germany or Hungary, they don't have this type of ancestry you see in the Yamnaya. And then after 5,000 years, it's everywhere. People mostly thought that there could not have been a big spread from the steppe, because how could pastoralists herding sheep and cattle make a huge impact demographically on a densely settled farming area like Europe was after 5,000 years ago? But they did. The genetic data shows they did it, and it's the main ancestral population of Europeans throughout Northern Europe and even much of Southern Europe today. Something huge happened, and again, it's the kind of surprise that this field yields. When we first started collecting DNA from ancient humans, we started seeing these transformative changes that happened, radical shifts in ancestry, huge mixture proportions, often sex-biased, where the two sources of ancestry that would come together in any mixture event, for example, European hunter-gatherers and European farmers, or Papuans and people of East Asian ancestry in the Southwest Pacific, would come together in very asymmetrical ways, with men from one group participating and women from another group participating. And this is telling you about events in the past. In some cases, it's evidence of probably extreme unhappiness and displacement. So one of the examples that we know from prehistory is in Spain, about 4,000 to 4,500 years ago, there's a movement of these steppe pastoralist-derived people into Spain. It's about 40% of the ancestry gets displaced by people coming from the east, but 100% of the Y chromosomes come from the east, which means that the local men completely fail to reproduce. These were disruptive events. These were events that completely changed the people who lived in different places in the past, and often were much more extreme or different from or completely unexpected compared to what people thought about before. The tree of human populations that I learned when I was learning about how human populations around the world are related to each other has a common ancestor, maybe somewhere in Africa, based on mitochondrial sequences, which are inherited from mother to daughter, splitting into different African lineages that are represented today, and then spreading out of Africa and splitting into East Asians and Australians and ancestors of Europeans, and then maybe Native Americans might split off East Asians, like a simple tree like that. And that corresponds to an idea that as people move around, they split, they don't remix, and they settle in different places around the world. But the truth is, from genetic data, that in every one of the places I mentioned, all of those groups are profoundly mixed, of multiple very divergent groups. So the truth is not a simple splitting from a common ancestor, but a kind of braided trellis going back into the past. When you send your DNA to a direct-to-consumer ancestry testing company, you might get back an answer like, you're 15% Irish, and you're 30% Nigerian, and you're 20% South Asian, or something like this. And what you're being told is an answer that's related to a very specific moment in time. Basically, what you're being told is if you roll back 500 years or 1,000 years, what fraction of your ancestors lived in Ireland, what fractions of your ancestors lived in West Africa somewhere, what fraction of your ancestors lived in South Asia somewhere. And we're making our best guess of that. But if you ask a question about another time, 80,000 years ago, you could ask another question, what are your ancestral components? And the thing that just comes clear from ancient DNA is that the people who lived in any one place 1,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago are almost never directly ancestral to the people who live in that place today. The pattern that we found in each case when we get a new ancient genome sequence is again and again, you find that this individual descends from a mixture of at least two, sometimes more than two, ancestral populations. So when it's the case that every time you collect new data, you find evidence that this group is mixed, the inevitable conclusion from induction is that everybody's mixed, at every time depth. And so what this has produced is an amazing dialogue between genetics, which provides this unambiguous information about what happened in the past, and archaeology, and sometimes linguistics, which provide other sorts of information, and it forces a new way of talking and discussing and thinking about these events in the past. The truth is that the world's a mystery, and that we've carved out areas of clarity. It certainly gives us a lot of perspective. I think that it should give us humility about whether our story about ourselves is the correct story. ancient DNA has disrupted a number of assumptions about who we are. Simple migration out of Africa, displacing the archaic humans who were there, that's out the door now. And it has also changed our understanding of the pattern of human evolution as one of simple branching to one that's definitely a trellis of mixings and mixings again over time. It's provided some little insight about the nature of how natural selection has shaped our species over time. It's showed that our genome is malleable in response to environmental changes like the ones that have occurred in the last 10 or 15 or 5,000 years. And so I think it adds nuance to our understanding of how our species is changing. It makes it clear that it's continuing to change going forward. And it sort of shows how we're all connected in myriad ways we never imagined.